Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. The Man in My Backyard by New Journey. My name is Anastasia, and a few days ago, something happened that makes me sick. We moved to an East Coast town about a year ago to be closer to family. So close, in fact, that my aunt, her wife, and my cousins are only a 10-minute walk from my house. Granted, we are very spaced out and borderline rural, despite living about 15 minutes from the outskirts of a big city. I was walking my two little dachshunds back home from my aunt's house. My mom hates it when I'm alone the majority of the day, so I spend time at their house. And I was genuinely enjoying my time. It was cold but quiet and oddly beautiful. I got home, fed my pups and two birds, and FaceTimed a friend. I was talking with them and doing chores and was admittedly being loud and giggly when taking out the trash to the cans on the side of my house. I got back inside and laid down in bed still chatting, when my bird started calling at something. Now, anyone who's owned a parrot knows that they have distinct noises for certain moments. She has been in my family for 76 years, and with me my whole life, so I know the sound was alarm and intrigue. I brushed it off as her seeing herself in the window as a reflection, and went back to talking to my friend. I got up to get some water, and my back was to the sliding glass door, which was thankfully locked. And my friend had the wind knocked out of him. I was confused, and I thought he was hurt. And he tells me, "Nastya, go back to your room now." I scoffed, but then I saw it in my camera view. There was a man with his face and hands pressed up against the glass door. He was a middle-aged white guy in a gray pullover and dark pants, and a grin on his face. My friend, ever the best in panic situations, told me, "Don't look at him, just go to your room." I was shaking so hard. I was blubbering and decided to lock me and my dogs in my closet. My parrot was still going crazy. English isn't my first language, and it's bad when I'm shocked. So I reverted back to my native language, which my friend doesn't know. Luckily, my friend knows enough to take charge, and he told me that he'd be over in 10 minutes, and he called the police. I was thinking that I could run to my mom's room and find her gun, so if the guy did come in the house, I could blow a quarter-sized hole in his chest. I was debating getting up and doing that when I heard tapping on my window. It was slow and intentionally creepy, and my stupid dog started barking. I was ready to accept my death. I was a teenage girl, home alone, and I was about to die. But wait, my aunt should be leaving for work, I thought. So I shot her a quick text. "Emmy, da ist ein Mann an meinem Fensterbeet, hilf mir." The tapping stopped, and I thought it was over. I left the front door unlocked when I took out the trash. This kept getting worse, and I begged my friend to hurry. The tapping, thankfully, returned to my window, and I could only close my eyes and hope that someone got there fast. It felt like an eternity crying to another teen who was breaking multiple traffic laws. Never before have I been grateful to hear another man's voice yelling outside my house at 1 a.m. It was my God-sent neighbor. Apparently, his pregnant wife was having bad nausea and went out on the deck, and where it's situated, you can see my whole backyard. She got a bad feeling after seeing the unfamiliar man approach my door and woke her husband to check it out. I thank God every day for her because I think she saved my life. I let my neighbors into my house and my aunt came about 4 minutes later packing major heat. My friend came over not long after her. I went from being home alone to an impromptu house party of concerned people. The police came like 10 minutes later, like they didn't just take 30 minutes to arrive to the scene. I mean, what the frick? Was that normal? On the brighter side, my bird wasn't too alerted by this encounter and went back to eating not 5 minutes later. And my dogs were just happy to see people. My friend has been staying the nights with me since. I'm finding it hard to be home alone, despite the fact that an arrest was made. I'm so thankful that my neighbor had such good instincts, and that my aunt and friend were so quick to their feet, because this could have been a lot worse. So, man at my window? Let's not meet. The Whistler in the Woods by Beat Foucault. So, this happened when I was 18, and I'm currently 33. I grew up in a rural area of Kentucky, and I lived next to the senator of Kentucky, who had bought our neighborhood when it was all just old farmland and woods. She was quite old, still alive today as well. So she had bought this land back in the 70s before she was the senator, and she had a lot of money from her parents. That was just a little backstory to understand as to why and how I lived next to her. When I was 18, my yard had backed up to the senator's house, and I worked her farmland and did chores around her land just to make some extra cash in the summer. The senator had massive amounts of land still that backed up into unused public land that went for miles and miles. Mainly tiny streams, fields, and trees, nothing too exciting. It was next to a small highway, and we had to cross it to get to the next part of the woodlines. My friend, who we will call Auntie, also did the chores and land work, and he had a little brother as well who we will call Willie. He was about 15. We all grew up in an area that was pretty safe, so our parents let us do whatever we wanted, and just to be back at a decent time. We often explored these lands during the day to see how far we could go or even find anything in the woods that would be pretty cool to explore. Usually we found nothing, some makeshift campsites for what we assumed was hunting, and just camping. One day, we went pretty close to dusk, and we happened to bring flashlights just in case it got too dark. This was during the fall of 2008, and the leaves were falling, and they were coating the ground pretty thick. As we were walking, I started to notice we had been going in a circle, and I assumed we were lost. We could no longer hear the highway that was close to us. The sun was going down pretty quick, and we only had maybe about an hour left of light. It eventually got dark, and we started walking around in the woods with our flashlights. It quickly got darker and darker. Now it was around 10 p.m. We were still lost. Before anyone asks why we didn't call someone with our cell phones, I grew up relatively modest, and my parents only gave me a flip phone, and service back then was shit. Throughout the night, we were trying our best to find the way we came, but it was near impossible in the dark in the very thick woods. My dad always told me when in the woods, if it became extremely quiet at any point, that means there was a much larger predator in the area. Now, mind you, we are technically in the Appalachia area, and we have all heard the stories of what not to do in the woods, specifically at night. Auntie, Willie, and I were walking, and suddenly everything in the area got extremely quiet, except for one noise, and that was a whistling. We all stopped dead in our tracks and began to look around in every direction in an attempt to verify where the sound was coming from. Unknowingly, Auntie whistled back, and we all know you are not supposed to whistle back in the woods, especially at night in the Appalachia regions of the world. I hit Auntie with my hand and told him, "Why would you do that?" And the whistling started to grow louder and louder, so I told everyone to start running. As we were running, the whistling got softer and softer, and eventually it went away. If we weren't lost before, we were now. As we were wandering around, it was about midnight, and it was a full moon, and it was lighting the area somewhat well. We happened to walk up on a shanty, just an old run-down shack. It looked like it still had somewhat of a door on it, and through the door we could see a small fire going. As any dumb white person would, we opened the door and asked if anyone was around. At that moment, we heard leaves crunching, and we all turned around, but nothing was there. As if it was a horror movie, the whistling started again, and it sounded like it was right next to us. We all turned towards the sound, and there she was, a woman in torn-up clothing and a really crappy appearance. She was about 5 feet from us. We slightly shifted back some, and we just looked at her with the flashlights pointing at her. We said, "Hello?" As if something we said made her lose her mind, she began screaming extremely loud. I mean, this wasn't normal screaming. It was primal. She lunged at Auntie, and out of reaction, Auntie swung his flashlight directly into the lady's face, and she fell to the ground. We started to run because we were terrified, and she began to take chase after us while still screaming. I assumed the lady had to be on drugs because she was extremely fast and pain did nothing to her, or she was just batshit insane. We were hauling ass through the woods for at least 15 minutes, and she was still chasing us. We eventually lost her. So we thought. We took a break behind some bushes, and we started hearing the whistling again. We sat there for at least an hour before we worked up the courage to keep running. We started running again, and we could hear someone close to us as well, running along. No longer did we hear the whistling, but we only assumed she was near us. We started to hear the highway again and finally got to it. Assuming she was still chasing us, we got as close as we could to the highway and flagged someone down. We were terrified this woman was waiting in the wood line, and we were frantically waving people down. The cars were scarce and no one stopped. Finally, someone did stop and let us in. He was pretty spooked because our faces were extremely pale, and he asked us what happened. We explained, and he told us that a lot of homeless, mentally incompetent people and drug users live in those woods. He took us home, and we never entered that place again. And that was the day I shit my pants running. Larry, Looking for Trouble and Finding It, by Linjaha. Here's an account of something that happened to my late husband John when he was between 16 and 18 years old. He had this friend named Larry. He thought Larry was a bit of a lame brain, but they shared an interest in working on cars back when you still could work on a car before they became so computerized. They and a couple of other guys would do what most boys did. They liked to diddy-bop around in their cars together and get into a little mischief from time to time. Nothing serious, just being adventurous. One day, Larry got the notion to check out a graveyard in Willoughby, Ohio, where John was living at the time. He'd heard some stories about it being haunted. John knew the one he was talking about, but he told Larry that it was a stupid idea. However, the other two guys that Larry mentioned it to were game. John rode along grudgingly, just to see if they'd really follow through with it. They arrived sometime after midnight, and the story was that there was a girl in blue that was killed by a train a long time ago. No one knew if it was an accident or a suicide, but she was wearing a blue dress when they found her body. She had no identification in her purse or her suitcase. The girl simply left a boarding house she was staying in and boarded a bus, only to be found much later by the railroad tracks. It was the biggest mystery in Willoughby at the time period. I remember hearing about it many times myself, and since no one knew who she was, the townsfolk took pity on her and got her a headstone engraved with "The Girl in Blue" and the date that she died. They weren't too sure about her birth date, other than that she appeared to be in her early 20s. No one knew where she came from or where she was headed. It was a rather sad story. I had seen the grave myself, but in the daytime and with the utmost respect. The story was that she must have just been in town to meet a paramour, but possibly was jilted by him. Being heartbroken, she then jumped in front of an oncoming train out of despair. Thus she was not at rest. It was said that she would wander around the grounds looking for the man that she thought loved her, but could never find him. The girl in blue became something of a legend in Willoughby, and to some degree she still is. Well, the guys got there, and Larry and the other two wanted to see if the legend was true. John would not enter the graveyard at all, so he stayed by the car. He told them they were a bunch of jerks wandering into a cemetery at night. He also told them that he personally didn't believe in disturbing the peace of a cemetery, and that he had too much respect for them. The guys berated him a little bit, but John stood his ground and refused to join them. John and I believe in the same principles, by the way. We were both Christians and believed in the supernatural since we both had encounters early on. We learned what you should and should not do in areas that you shouldn't venture into to begin with. I guess you could say that we accumulated some wisdom from our past experiences, eh? However, the Three Stooges, as John later called them, had just had to prove how tough and brave they were, and proceeded to enter the cemetery through the wrought iron gates while John waited by the car smoking a cigarette. John later said that they were gone long enough for him to smoke a few more. He said he could hear them talking in the distance, but couldn't make out the conversation. He could hear them chuckling and getting a bit loud, but he wasn't the least bit curious as to what they were doing. He just remained steadfast by the car. He said they were gone maybe 20 minutes or so when he heard Larry calling out to him. John answered back to him asking what he wanted. After that, John said he heard all of them scream and saw them running back towards the gate where he was waiting. Once they got through the gate, Larry was heaving and winded, but kept yelling, "Get in the car! Just get in the car, now, man!" They all piled into the car muttering expletives and screaming to just take off. Larry was so rattled that he accidentally backed into a small sapling before regaining his wits and putting the car in drive. Once they were finally on the way out of there, they quieted down enough to tell John what had happened to them. Up to that point, John didn't utter a word. He could tell they were freaked out of their wits. According to Larry, they were joking around and daring someone to come forward or do something. They never expected something to happen, but it did. While they were standing near the girl in blue's headstone, they thought they heard someone walking in the leaves not far from them. When they looked off to the side about 20 feet or so in the distance, they saw a figure coming towards them. That was when Larry called out to John, thinking it was him. However, when John answered back from outside the gates, they knew that something was wrong. They just stood there fixated on the figure coming towards them. They could tell it was a man, but what actually sent them screaming was the fact they didn't see any legs as he was coming towards them. But they could hear the crunching of the leaves as he was moving. Again, there were no legs or feet to make those sounds. They all saw it. From there, they just bolted out of the gates and didn't look back. John admitted that he had a sense of "I told you so" satisfaction because he told them not to pursue the idea in the first place. That was part of the reason that John referred to Larry as a lame brain. I agree. I met Larry a few months after John and I got together, and there's nothing wrong with Larry. He's just a natural-born jerk. However, when I asked him about the cemetery adventure, he absolutely refused to talk about it. It left him that shook up. In regard to the girl in blue, she was finally identified in 2000-something. The local paper, the News Herald, ran a special story on her, and someone took the initiative to send that story to other states in hope of ending the mystery of solving her identity. They drew an artist's conception of her based on the old autopsy report and eyewitness accounts as to what she looked like. She was an unknown from 1940-something when she perished, and that's when the mystery began. However, when she was finally identified after all those years, it was by one of her brothers in another state who was elderly by that time. Most of her immediate family was very sparse, but at last she was identified. The brother came out to Willoughby and thanked the paper for printing that story and releasing it elsewhere, because when he read it and saw her picture, he said it closed a hole in his heart and other family members' hearts. The mystery girl in blue finally had a name at last. They erected a new stone with her name inscribed on it. I'm not mentioning her name out of respect for the family that waited so very long to find out what happened to her so long ago. But it's nice that she finally has family to recognize her and be aware of her death. Fourth of July Creep by Willow Walk 627. This story took place 5 years ago when I was 13 years old. Like any typical middle schooler, I had a group of friends who I would regularly hang out with. It was the 4th of July, and I decided to have my 6 friends over. We watched a movie, jumped on the trampoline, ate food, and did fireworks. I live in a safe neighborhood located in a nice suburb. It was around 9:30 p.m. when we decided to ride bikes and skateboards over to the elementary school in a neighborhood half a mile down the road. We got there and messed around for a while, and at about 10:15 started to head home. Half of my friends had already left the school parking lot, and the other 2 and I started to follow. For reference, the exit of the lot has a stop sign, and you can either turn left, right, or go straight. If you go straight, it leads you directly to a road with houses. The friends who left the lot before us went straight. As we began to ride away, an older beat-up tan car turned into the school lot. One friend and I noticed this and stopped dead in our tracks. We knew something was wrong as the passenger side window rolled down and the car slowed down as it approached us. The 3 of us were on skateboards and picked them up and started to run towards our friends. One of the girls who was with us was laughing hysterically because she hadn't noticed the car and thought we were trying to race her. After the other girl noticed the severity of the situation, she began yelling at the girls who were right down the street that there was a car following us. Now here's the part where you guys may get mad, because every horror movie has taught us not to do this. We reached the point where our other friends were, and there was a car driving by. We started banging on their windows, screaming and begging for help. 2 female teenagers rolled down their windows, confused, and we just pointed at the car that was leaving the school lot headed directly towards us. All 6 of us left the bikes and skateboards in the middle of the road as the 2 girls told us to get into the car. It was a sedan, meaning 6 of us were crammed in a back seat meant for 3 people. They drove through the neighborhood slowly at first because they were trying to understand why there was a group of 6 hysterical girls in their car. We started screaming, "He's following us!" And the girl driving hit the gas because she finally understood why we were so upset. She lost the car and told me to call my parents. He asked me to hand the phone to the girl who was driving and told her to go back to the place where she had picked us up, turn the car and headlights off, and he would meet us there. I had a Life 360 group with my parents, so they could easily get to us without needing directions. When we arrived at the spot, the female got on the phone with some of her friends. Luckily, she lived a few houses down from where we were, and her brother had a few friends over. They were these massive buff football players at the local high school, and they all came out of the house. The boys asked us to describe the man, and we told them what we had seen. My dad arrived and we had all started running over to him, but the boys started to press him because we started screaming, "That's him! That's him!" We weren't pointing at my dad. We were pointing at the same car with the same man in it who we had been hiding from. My dad had his hands up in the air telling the boys that he was the parent, and that's when they caught on to the fact that we were pointing to the other car. The man still had his windows rolled down and looked at us with a grin I will never forget. The boys ran after the car. One had no shoes on and ran through rocks just trying to get a picture of this guy's plate. The man knew he was being followed and sped off before a picture could be taken, though. We loaded the bikes and skateboards in the trunk, and my dad took us all home. We called the police and they questioned us, but we never heard anything about it again. To this day, I wonder if he was just a creep, or if he had worse intentions. I still think of those girls, too, and what would have happened if they weren't driving by that exact moment. Crazy Conspiracy Theorist Classmate by Scarlett A.K. I have to premise that English is not my first language, so apologies for any mistakes in this text going forward. With that said, strap in, it's going to be long. So, where to even begin? In my country, the government decided to push free professional classes to anyone who's either benefiting from welfare or just unemployed. I'm 30 and a female. I decided to enroll in one of those classes before moving to another state next year. Just to have something more on my CV, and have to have an excuse to touch grass since I'm unemployed. And I specifically picked a social media marketing and management formation that started 3 months ago. Everything was great about it, and it seemed to me all my classmates and professors were great people. I even started to make some friends. I must point out that no one in my class is underage, the youngest being 21 and the oldest 56. After a couple of weeks of classes, they introduced us to the main curriculum of the whole course that will involve a few months-long group project amongst the students. The project consisted of inventing a brand from the ground up and marketing it on social media as if it was a real thing about to launch on the market. I was super excited about this and couldn't wait to face the challenge. They picked the groups at random, and the RNG gods chose for me to be paired with a 56-year-old woman. We'll call her M. She barely spoke to anyone up until that point. Thinking she was nothing but a nice lady, I tried to accommodate her for any preferences she'd have on the project, such as choosing what the topic would be about. She immediately started telling me half her life story, just out of nowhere, and focused particularly on a skin issue that she had claimed doctors only made worse, and how she cured herself with herbs and essential oils. In hindsight, this was already the first red flag. Her rambling just left me scratching my head, and just to break the awkward silence, I said we could pick that as a brand idea. Natural remedies, food supplements, and cosmetics brands that's not some MLM or a cult. She immediately agreed and smiled like a little girl, which back then made me kind of happy. After then, she picked the name, idea for a logo and motto without asking me for an opinion, saying it felt important to her. Put a pin in that for later. And since I had no experience with this niche, I should learn from her. She insisted so much I had to comply, and that's when hell started for me. She would call and message me on WhatsApp constantly, insisting to see me work in real time on the designs, logos, mock-ups, etc., because she needed to supervise my actions. Her excuse was that I was a little girl that hadn't known the world yet. She never liked any of my work and forced me to redo things over and over again. I'm on the spectrum and have a very hard time setting boundaries with people or dealing with the idea of displeasing someone. So I kept pushing myself to stay strong and keep going because I couldn't deal with how this woman would have reacted to anything she might have seen as insubordination. On top of the fact, I didn't want to fail the course, and from the beginning all of our profs insisted the group project was vital to the final score. It was on one of those calls that she started telling me some of the most unhinged shit I've ever heard in my life. After seeing me drink a sip of an energy drink, she screamed at me to toss that garbage away, and then explained to me the reason why. In her opinion, energy drinks, sodas, and junk food are infested with nanomachines that affect the human body and rewrites their DNA. She then explained that that's because the great powers are not aliens like most think, but androids and AI hive minds, ready to enslave humanity through biomechanical control. She also kept going on about how AIs existed since before Christ, came from an ancient civilization before the Great Reset, and that all great men in history were actually androids or giants. She did go on a great tangent about Nephilims and such. She also threw in the fact she was sure dinosaurs were nothing but a fairy tale and could never have existed. So in her opinion, big people can exist, but big birds can't. Wow. The first incident, the biggest one, happened last month on one weekend evening where instead of slaving away for her, I went out with my mom to visit some friends to be back the next morning. I forgot my phone at home and realized too late, but since Em and I hadn't agreed to work that night, I thought nothing of it. Man, was I naive. My phone was blown up with messages and phone calls, all from Em except a couple of messages from another classmate of mine that told me she had called him obsessively with demands of him showing up at my front door to make sure I was okay. He had mentioned to her before that we had lived on the same block. Later that week, I got called into the school administration because Em apparently had called them too and told them that I had gone missing for 3 or 4 days. I tried in vain to keep it together, but just burst into tears in front of the secretaries, telling and showing them all this woman was putting me through, explaining my boundary-setting issues, and they decided to immediately inform the profs and find a solution that would allow me to not have any more contact with her. But before they could take any action, me and Em were informed one more student was going to join the group. We'll call him T. Nothing much to say about him. He's super nice and did help out that following week by not complying to Em's demands and unreasonable standards, insisting I take time off to do my own things too. For some reason, she never bitched about decisions made by T. In my last call with M and T, M goes on another unhinged rant. This one will be relevant later, and it's what makes this story fucked up on multiple levels. She claimed she's being gang-stalked and sabotaged by Big Pharma because she had invented a miracle ointment that could reconstruct any sort of biological tissue. She said she tested it on the hand of a friend of hers that had third-degree burns, claiming she saw the nerves, tendons, muscles, and skin grow back, saving the hand. She then added that a prototype of said ointment that mostly consisted of garlic and aloe cured her husband from cancer a few years back. She also added how after an accident over a decade ago, the doctors decided to sabotage her uterus during an emergency surgery to prevent her from having children. More of the Big Pharma sabotages included several lawsuits she was involved in. She concluded that she's taking SMM classes with us because she wants to learn how to communicate with social media and the new generation. I'm personally afraid she's going to try to scam desperate people into buying her BS garlic and aloe miracle cure. The second incident happened the next day before class. A friend decided to sit next to me since that class of the day wasn't going to involve the group projects. We put our stuff on the desk, and since we were early, decided to go into the next room to get a coffee. M came in and we heard a commotion in the classroom. When we peeked inside, we saw her tossing my friend's stuff to another desk. My friend asked what the hell she was doing, and M just coldly responded, "The seat next to OP is mine." I nodded at my friend as if to say, it's okay, to try and defuse the situation before it escalated. 2 days later, we get informed that I was swapped from M's group to another one. I will say that finally I'm working with the girl I made friends with, and we're having a lot of fun. So while I thought it was over, no more of M's weird shit, right? Right? The calls and messages from her never ended. Actually, she started obsessively calling the school and the profs as well to protest about the decision of removing me from her group. Her texts were filled with weird, trivial questions about random topics, or very personal questions, up to 50-60 texts per day. At that point, I stopped responding almost entirely to her and screenshotting everything she was sending me. This leads us to the third and last incident, at least so far, that happened last week. I can't go too much into detail because it involves geopolitical beliefs, and I don't want a war in the comments. The short, clean version of events is, M, in class, asked the prof a question that involved a very important global matter. He replied and then asked us about our opinion. 2 people spoke before I did, giving examples of people or brands getting canceled for sharing political stances unwisely, and how a problematic or controversial history or presence on social media might impact negatively one's chances of employment. It was only once back home I realized that M had sent me several rage-filled texts, claiming I was incredibly rude to have answered to her instead of letting the prof answer, and that she was expecting my apologies. I wrote a long text to her explaining myself and told her that I would not apologize since I had done nothing wrong, and finally blocked her number. She thankfully hasn't been able to find me on social media yet because I don't use my real name online. Since then, she's missed all classes, which is nice because I really don't want her to try and confront me in person. But it's what I've learned today from one of my classmates during break that left me horrified and pushed me to write this post. One of my classmates, we'll call her Y, told me M and her had been exchanging text from time to time, mostly because Y took pity on M, thinking, like I did at first, she was just some weird old and lonely lady. In one batch of texts, she went into detail about her husband that had passed away from cancer a few years back. Some of the texts read, "We fought tooth and nail. We didn't bend over to men nor God, but they took him away from me anyway." Or, "I was so close to keep him with me." Or, "At least I know he trusted and followed me until the end." Those are verbatim, because after putting 2 and 2 together, me and Y, we figured she's either delusional and lying about everything, or she tried to cure her husband from cancer with her ointment instead of traditional medicine, effectively killing him. Also, we found out she's already selling her services inside of a spa belonging to a relative of hers, using the name she picked for our project. She's also been using my work for her personal social media pages involving her services, which explains why she was so obsessive about supervising my work. She was basically getting free commissions out of me. Today was my last day of class before the holidays, and after that it's just going to be 3 months until classes are over. I don't know where the story will lead me to further, but honestly, I hope she never shows back up to class again. I'm really hoping to not have to come back with more updates. Active Shooter in My Apartment Building by NashGuy39. This incident took place in the summer of 2023. Last year, I transferred with my company to take a new position in a major Midwestern city. My spouse was still working and living back in California for the next few months, so I rented a studio apartment for myself in a newly renovated apartment building in a popular downtown neighborhood until we could look for a better place together. The apartment was small but nice. It was in a secure building with interior hallways and a nice downstairs lobby. I was one of the first tenants to move into this newly renovated building, and other new residents soon started moving in. A major advantage of this move was that I'd only be a couple of hours' drive from my hometown and my parents. I started my new job and everything was going great. I was enjoying my new neighborhood, and the neighbors in the apartment building generally kept to themselves like I did. Then, a new guy moved in across the hall, and everything changed. We'll call him David. David was a single man in his 60s, and was very different from the college students and young professionals who lived in our building. I started noticing his erratic behavior almost immediately. I would come home from work and he would be sitting in his car in our small parking lot, just staring off in the distance. We were having issues that summer with smoke clouds coming over from the vast Canadian wildfires. They were leaving a light dusting of ash on our cars, similar to pollen. David was convinced that someone was spraying this dust on his car and was accusing various tenants he would run into in the parking lot. He would hoard trash in his apartment and leave trash bags in the hallway, causing a foul odor. He would also be yelling to himself in the hallway. I finally had enough and complained to the leasing office. The manager was quick to dismiss my concerns, saying that she'd been in his apartment and everything was fine. In August, my parents' 50th anniversary was coming up, and I was excited to go home and spend a weekend with them. A few days before their anniversary, my boss informed me that he would be flying in to work on an important project with me that would have us working through the weekend. I was really disappointed and felt like I was letting my parents down. But I managed to get away for a quick overnight trip in the middle of the week to see them and get back before my boss was due to arrive. I drove down and spent the night with them. The next morning, I checked my email as I was getting ready to head back. There was an email from my apartment manager in regard to the incident the night before. The email was very vague, but it stated that a resident was dead and there would be further details coming later. My heart sank and I immediately went pale. My mind instinctively went to my strange neighbor, David. I opened up a local news app for my city, and the top story was about an active shooter in my apartment building who was killed during a SWAT team standoff the night before. Apparently, David approached my next-door neighbor in the hallway with a gun and threatened to shoot him. The neighbor ran into his apartment and called 911. David also called 911 and told the dispatcher that his neighbors were hacking his phone, and if the police didn't come, he was going to start shooting people. The police came and tried to talk to David, but he had barricaded himself in his apartment and claimed to be heavily armed. The state police and SWAT teams soon arrived, and David began firing a rifle out his window at anyone he saw in the parking lot below. All of the neighbors on my floor were trapped in their apartments with no way to escape. They had to get down and barricade themselves from the gunfire. There was another building across the street with a direct line of sight into our apartment building. A police sniper took a position in the building across the street and shot David through his window. Then they flew a drone in his open window and confirmed that he was dead with a gun still in his hand. Luckily, no one else was injured. I got home later that day to a bullet-ridden apartment building, and several neighbors who normally didn't speak to each other were hugging and crying and showing each other videos of the incident from their hiding places. I've never been so lucky to have been out of town. If my boss hadn't messed up my plans, I would have been home that night. I'm sorry David didn't get the mental health attention he needed, but he put so many lives in danger. The Field and the Deer by Burst Beast. This story happened 20 years ago, and I have not lived in that area for much of that time, so this is not a current personal story. But I think that the location is relevant to the creepy feelings, and of course, I encourage others to look up the references I bring up. I grew up on Long Island, New York. Many Long Island town names are Native American-based, and I've heard they're pretty wild to pronounce for those who did not grow up there. Hauppauge, Patchogue, Copaig, Massapequa, only 2 of those rhyme. Not sorry for any of the other names I mention here. Long Island is already home to creepy stories, such as the Amityville Horror House. I have countless stories of myself or friends or family checking out historic places back then, such as shut-down asylums, haunted railway or highway crossings, Mary's Grave, etc. And then, of course, there were the random disappearances, some of which ended up being the Long Island Ripper, a case which recently got an alleged perpetrator. I didn't realize this at the time of the story, but the place my friends and I went to was in the same category of all these unsettling things. To be clear, I have no idea if this was supernatural or not, but the history I'll later explain creeps me out either way. Every St. Patrick's Day, my mother, her friends, their kids, and any of my friends who wanted to tag along would go out to Montauk for the big parade. Montauk is gorgeous, by the way, and the sunset is allegedly famous. One of my mother's friends owned a room in another famous attraction, the Montauk Manor, and we all went to visit after a long day of shenanigans. My friends and I, being teenagers, still had energy to spare, so we asked if we could rent tennis rackets and just play around on the completely empty court. There were 4 of us, so we just played 2 versus 2 of whack the ball as hard as we could at each other. Most of the balls went over the massive chain-link fences because of our ridiculousness, and I didn't want my mother's friend to get in trouble for us losing the balls, so I asked my friends to split up and collect them all. I think we had a batch of about 10 or 20, so we knew how many to look for. I took the neighboring field and grumbled in a teenage angst about why there would be a tall, wheat-yellow grass field right next to a tennis court with a 10-foot-tall fence, mind you. I managed to find a lot of the balls we were looking for right on the edge of the tall grass, so I tossed them behind me onto the asphalt and figured a bunch probably rolled into the field itself. So I went onto this neighboring property to look. I was alone, and I can't explain this any better, but I felt compelled to look up from my ground search and look out to the field. There was a large rock, unsure if it counted as a boulder, that stuck out from the 5-foot-tall grass right in the middle of the field, maybe 100 or 200 feet away, and although I'd seen it before, I was stunned to see a figure sitting on top of this rock. I can see this in my mind's eye to this day. It was a very lanky figure, presumably male from the short hair, and either wearing a very tight shirt or nothing on top. Whatever the bottoms were, looked like some sort of skirt or kilt-looking item that stopped around the knees. I can't describe much more because the figure was unnaturally dark, as if no light penetrated this strange silhouette while the sun was still very much up and shined on both of us. I didn't register the darkness at first because the second I looked up and my eyes locked onto this person, the figure quickly slid off the rock, and I saw the tall grass shaking towards my direction. My immediate thought was, "Oh shit, that's the farmer's son and I shouldn't be in this field," so I turned to make a quick exit. I went into the field on a diagonal, so when I turned it was a new path out as I tried to escape any potential consequences. And on the short route back, I skidded to a halt at an extremely disturbing sight. In a gap in the tall grass was a dead deer, and right next to it, a very old-looking tennis ball, likely not one of ours. The sight made me freeze, and in the moment I did a quick scan to try to understand what I was seeing. I eventually focused on something I couldn't explain in the moment. There was a hole in its chest right between the front legs, but there was no blood or smell or flies. This is where I lost whatever cool I had and started screaming to my friends to go, "Run, we need to get out of here." The panic in my voice apparently convinced them very quickly. Back at the manor door, I explained what I saw. They were questioning why I screamed at them, especially when I insisted that we look for the tennis balls. But after explaining the deer, they were pale and silent. Chalking it up to teenage energy plus stupidity, and probably myself still running on adrenaline, my friends eventually said they needed to see this deer, and I agreed to show them the area I was in. I told them that we could try to find it again, but someone saw me on the property, so we shouldn't trespass or anything. After a good couple of minutes to calm down, we went back over and we were still on the manor's asphalt paving, just peering around to see if we could spot the deer through the grass. My friend actually did, and we found out that it was one row away and easily visible if we used our arms to push some grass aside. I looked up again, not compelled but probably paranoid, to look at the rock and to make sure the only grass that was moving was due to the wind. Then we stepped back into the field to get a good look at this thing. We were all creeped out by the lack of blood, despite a cavernous hole being there. There just wasn't any evidence of violence at all. There was nothing on the ground or around this hole in the fur, just a dark, empty space where fur and other things like tissue should be. After a couple of quiet minutes, someone said, and I honestly can't remember if it was me or my friends, "That's where the heart would be." I remember a coldness growing over me, and suddenly I was no longer interested in what happened here. It felt to me like everyone got this feeling, and while there was a now funny to me morbid question of, should we grab the tennis ball? We all left without another word to each other. After the shock wore off, and we were walking through the manor and back to my mother's friend's room, we talked about how crazy it was, but that was the last we spoke of it. Until I Googled Long Island haunted places one day, years later. I don't remember the reasoning now, but knowing me, I was probably looking for a cool place to drive that night. On the site the Montauk Manor was listed, and that cold feeling washed over me again. I read about how the place was built upon countless Native American graves, how rituals were often done on the old and new grounds, and how shadow people were seen in the manor's hallways. We didn't see the latter, but the rest of it made me question a lot of what I saw that cold March day. I immediately messaged 2 of the friends who went with me with, "Do you remember that time?" And they were absolutely baffled at the news, which was validating for me. It's become a cool niche legend for us, but at the same time, none of us have ever gone back there. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you would like to hear narrated on this channel or my podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Kicking off the new year with a new open, please tell me if you like it or not. And of course, like, share, and subscribe to this video channel. If you haven't already, follow me on social media, links to that are in the description below. And if you'd like to support the channel in a much deeper way, please find my link to Patreon, as well as my TeePublic page. Get yourself some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merch. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.